All right, hey everyone. My name is Trovarsi, and today my special guest here is Anton Riehl. He's a composer, a producer, a synthesist, and I really enjoy the way he utilizes various ways of patching, and he brings that into his compositions. And I thought that him, getting into Logic, and that's something I know that we've all talked about, wanting to talk about in this group, and I thought he would be the perfect person to take us through that. So, yeah, without further ado, we have Anton Riehl. And one other thing I just want to say, as far as questions, just because, as you know, or for me, sometimes logic patching and explaining can be a little, tricky, I guess, or can be slightly confusing. So let's raise our hands and or drop questions in the chat, and then when we have a place to pause, he'll go through and answer any questions that you all have. So we won't interrupt him while he's in the middle of explaining the patch, just to kind of not break that flow. Okay, cool. All right, Anton. So I'll ask everyone to kind of mute up, and I'll mute too, and I'll let you take it from here.
All right. Thanks for having me, Trovarsi, and thanks to all of you for coming to listen. I kind of want to start off by saying, obviously some of these topics are a little more advanced, or can be. They don't have to be, but a lot of the times that people are getting into it, they already have a little bit of background. So there are going to be times when I maybe jump to an idea that, requires some background, and if you don't have it, please let me know, and also feel free to ask me any questions, because I find that this topic is easy to get lost in. So that being said, we'll get started, and I have a little bit of an outline. So I just kind of wanted to start by talking about the difference between analog logic and Boolean logic, because those two topics, that's one of those places. They both have an or option, and that is something that I think a lot of people start by getting, it's a little bit confusing. So for this presentation, I have both options in the case. They're kind of spread out everywhere. For the most part, I have Boolean logic on the left-hand side of the case, and I have the analog logic a little bit more in the bottom and center. When we think about it, analog logic is going to always have like a CV or a value. It's not going to be an on or off. It means that when we're looking at analog logic, the output could be variable. When we're looking at Boolean logic is sort of the basis of digital logic, and it's going to be on or off. And so it's important for us to kind of differentiate where we hear those things, because, yeah, obviously that's a place where something might confuse someone. So you'll also notice when we get to the analog logic that there are a lot of different names for some of the same outputs. You'll hear or as an option, but sometimes that can also be max. Sometimes that can also be any. So it's also important to understand that because it has that option, we should kind of pay attention to that. And if you can see it, some modules like this tip-top Buchla, the OR logic output has the symbol on it, and the OR logic looks similar to, here's the Boolean version of that same symbol. I don't know how easily we can see those, but it is important to note that they are kind of related. They use some of the same symbols. Anyway, the only other thing I wanted to talk about before we really get started as sort of an aside to logic, in particular Boolean logic, is that because Boolean logic is on or off, there will inevitably be in every logic module some level of comparator. And for anyone who doesn't understand what a comparator is, it just takes the input value, and if you're above a certain threshold, you're going to have it on, and if you're below a certain threshold, you'll have it off. And because every logic module has it in there, the type of logic that, or the type of output that you get, let's say you're using an LFO to drive your logic, you're going to have to meet a threshold. And so if you don't know what that threshold is, that may change your expectation. And so I just wanted to throw out there that if you ever need to have a little more control, getting an actual comparator will give you more control. You can actually, like this may have a comparator that limits it to maybe above 8 volts or above 4 volts, depending on what range you're working in. A comparator gives you the option to control that yourself. So it is important to understand that the comparator is what changes analog logic to Boolean logic. And so these are available in a lot of different modules. I'm going to try to avoid being too module specific in this conversation, but I think that's a really important concept to understand. And I see that there's something in the chat.
I was just saying that as you go through, what I like to do is I'll search for the module or something like that and drop it in the chat in case somebody wants to take a closer look at it while you're talking. I'll just kind of be doing that in the background, just to give you a heads up.
Sure. Sounds good.
Okay, cool.
Is there any questions so far? Because I really wanted to, that comparator thing was something that took me a while to get myself. And so I just want to make sure that everyone understands that that is an option that you can, you can change how your modular works even when a manufacturer does something. So if you don't like the way a module works, get a module that fixes it for you, is kind of where I'm going with that. So yeah, I think that's, I guess, a good place to start. And I'm going to start, I think we'll probably focus on Boolean logic first today, because I think that's the topic that people were expecting to hear about. So I have a little bit pre-patched here. We're going to mostly be patching in real time, which also gives you guys time to ask questions if you need to. I'll just walk you through a little bit of what I have going on. I have a clock running off my muck slicer with a few different gate sequencers here. I have another gate sequencer up here on the Tubutech. I have the drum machine module, a foundation oscillator, and we're just using as a mixer for today. I have 2 clock dividers. I find clock dividers will be very useful, as well as some probability controls if we decide to go down that route. Yeah, and so I guess let's go and we'll kind of go from there. So what I have going I have my clock feeding just a clock divider, and we're just feeding some drums right now. And basically the hi-hat is running 8th notes and the kick drum, 16th notes, and the kick drum is on 1 and 4. So it's divide by 4 and just divide by 1. So this is a really simple option. And on my muck slicer, I have this currently patched into a snare, so we can kind of do, simple drums. So we kind of have anything going here that we want to do. So my goal with this sort of regular beat was to try and hear what a clock divider sounds like running through the different the different logic modules. So I'm using the Instro logic module, and the reason I like this one is just because it has all of the logic options in one. So we basically have and NAND, OR and NOR, XOR and XNOR, and NOT. We're not really going to be covering NOT much today, just because it is basically just the inversion of whatever you're using. So yeah, that's where we'll go. One of the things that I love about this particular module is that in the manual for it, Jason included simple rhythms that you can get just by using each one at the same time. So I'm just going to patch my clock into my clock divider. I'm just going to use a quick end of cycle to synchronize this to everything. And what we're going to just do is we're going to take divide by 4. Actually, sorry, let me go slightly longer cables. We're going to do divide by 2 and divide by 4. And these start creating, as you can see, sort of a syncopated rhythm. So if we take the we'll take the snare and we'll put it on and. And then we'll take the NAND and we'll put it on a tom. So these types of rhythms are very simple. And because we're just taking 2 outputs, there's that ratio of these are even outputs, so we're going to always get sort of a even relationship. We get sort of this dotted 16th, dotted 8th, 16th rhythm. But that rhythm can then extend beyond that just by cycling through the clock divider. So if we just slow it down, you can hear that we're now getting something that's sort of like 1 and 3, right? So you get that same proportion of 1 and 3 just by using the and the NAND. If we go further, what you start to hear is that we can create basically generative drum beats just by using a clock divider and one set of logic modules. And what can be interesting then is if we do odd numbers, we get a similar driving rhythm that cycles a little bit more often. So now we're dividing by 3 and by 5. We could divide by 5 and 7. And we get this long type of phrase. This is dividing by 7 and 9. And I like this one. You know, we start getting these things that are almost like just little accents here and there. And we can always go maybe 1 even and 1 odd. So again, you know, this is really, really simple, but you can start building up really complex patches just with one logic module, right? So let's take the same thing. Let's go to our OR instead of our AND. And I think we've gotten off our beat. Let me just reset our clock so we're back in time. And again, you know, you start to hear, oh, we're still on 3. That's why. Like that's a surprisingly complicated pattern going on there. Okay, now we're back to divide by 2 and divide by 4 on the beat. And yeah, you can hear, again, pretty straightforward. If we rotate our clock divider, the or is a little bit straighter than the and, in my opinion, or I guess just sort of naturally. But when we start dividing by 3, so I'm only using a clock divider right now. I could use a clock multiplier instead of a divider. So right now I don't have a clock multiplier in here other than on the muck slicer. So we can definitely get multiply as opposed to divide. Do the same with the and. Sorry, this was a question that came up. So what we're getting is we're getting our multiplier, but only when our divider is active, if that makes sense. Definitely a clock multiplier is useful, especially for using something like a hi-hat, you know, like if I was just using a, so like here I have my hi-hat on just 4, you know, still divide by 4, it's offset just because I happen to miss the clock division or the timing, but you could use then like a clock multiplier. Let's take our clock multiplier into the hi-hat instead and pull on those. I don't like this as much, but let's pull out the tom. There we get that same idea of a clock multiplier, and it's only multiplying when we have our divider up. So we're keeping it active whenever this light is lit, and then we're multiplying it by whatever we have the muck slicer's output set to. And so you can combine these, of course, and get a lot of different varieties of interesting outputs. Just to kind of keep going on this little path, I just want to listen to what it sounds like through the XOR. We'll patch back into, what was I using before? Snare and tom. We'll put our 16th note hi-hat back on just to kind of keep the rhythm going. So XOR gives us yet another variety of that, those kinds of like rhythms. This one a lot of people see as a 16th note dotted 16th, so they're a little closer together. But so we start getting kind of basic outputs. I actually like the XOR for another layer of rhythm, which would be, let's say we're taking our kick, and what we want to do is we want to put a snare that mutes the kick. So if we take our kick drum output and we now run that into the kick, we should start by getting the same for, right, so we're back to our same rhythm. And I'm gonna just throw a snare, sorry, I'm going to mult where this snare is coming out. So let's say we are going to take our snare and we're going to have it every 4, right? We seem to be off timing-wise. There we go. Okay, so here we basically have the kick divided by 4, and we have the snare every other round on the snare. But if we don't want the kick to play when the snare plays, we can run the other side. We can run that mult that I took into the XOR. And now when the snare is playing, the kick is not playing. And so we're basically using this to duck the kick drum out whenever the snare plays, if that makes sense. We're doing it with logic, and so you know, it adds a little bit of that character. But this only works if the timing of the kick and the snare line up. Right now I timed it so that our divide by 4 matches where the snare hits are. And so we're sort of like, it's sort of race conditions basically, which is not necessarily how we want to be addressing this. And what will happen is if we run the snare on another beat that doesn't line up with where that kick is happening, we're actually adding a kick at the same time. So if we use another logic module, what we can do, so I'm going to mult our kick sound, our kick CV. I'm going to mult that to the and to the other side of the XOR. And then take our output that was going to the kick, and now run the and to our kick. We should. I think I did something wrong. Oh, yeah, I didn't patch into the kick. And now we can do a complicated snare part. The kick is still running on its own, but if we put the kick and the snare together, now the kick is being muted again. So by using 2 logic modules, you're able to sort of play whatever kick line you want, whatever snare line you want, and the snare will now isolate from the kick. That is a complicated patch, and sorry I did it quickly. There's a lot to cover, so I am kind of like moving quickly. But any other thoughts about how this is working, musically speaking? So, right, and it's really simple. Like, I'm not doing all that much to get these kinds of rhythms. So when you start combining them, it becomes pretty straightforward. The other way that I sometimes like to think about these is on the or. Let's look at doing like a complicated hi-hat pattern. So we'll put our kick back on 2 and 4. Okay. Pull out our rat's nest that we created. All right. So let's start. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I'm just going to make a comment while you're patching. And I like that it's like a way to create these interesting drum fills and have some control over that.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah, it's very cool.
So let's start by using an OR, and we're going to take that into the hi-hat. And we're going to also clock, instead of clocking our clock divider, let's clock another sequencer right next to it. So this is just another gate sequencer. And we'll just synchronize our clocks, so they should now be lining up. And if we look down, we should see these are staying relatively in time with each other. So we could take the output of two of these into the OR, and we'll take the other output. This will seem obvious at first, and hopefully we'll find some interesting ways. So if I wanted to get back to that 16th note pattern, I could just set one or the other of these to always be 16th notes, right? If I alternate back and forth, we'll get the same effect. Right, so what we're getting right now is we're getting a 16th note pattern, and it's just going back and forth between our two sequencers, our two gate sequencers. If I were to now shift one of these, let's say I'm going to make the muck slicer only 7 notes. What we get is one is shifting and one is not. So let's simplify one of the rhythms. And so now what we start to see is if we're combining these two sequences together, we get something that shifts over time. And you can use these to create musical hi-hat rhythms. I like this 7 versus 8. 7 over, again, 16, 15 over 8. There's so many ratios that you can easily create with just a simple loop like this. And this is combining them together. Where it also becomes interesting is as we're shifting those, let's do the XOR instead. That same concept of muting one note and not the other. I'm going to get rid of that ratchet. So now what we're getting is we're getting that same combination, but it's still shifting. So we have a 7-note phrase and an 8-note phrase, and they're kind of always shifting in and out of phase. When they line up, we don't hear anything. When they don't line up, we get a more complex rhythm, and this will shift over time. Yeah, this definitely one way. So in the chat, they're asking, one of the values is that you can create a longer overall variation with a simple sequencer. Everything I'm using is simple sequencers, right? Obviously, you can apply this to complex sequencers, but there's a lot of value in cycling multiple lengths of sequencers against each other. So yes, I completely agree. And it also starts creating generative options, right? So we could also be comparing these. We could take the OR combination. This is a cascading logic, but it's cascading on the wrong side. So I want the OR output, but then maybe I want to also use a clock divider. Actually, let's go to AND instead. We can use our same idea of only playing it for certain amounts of time. And we can get musical phrases of complicated hi-hat rhythm, the amount of time that it's going to take for this phrase to repeat exactly gets extended the more of this variation you create. So we could even go as far as like taking our initial 2 clock values into our XOR, and now we're using OR and XOR to feed an AND logic, and we could get pretty complicated rotating, shifting hi-hat parts. So things like this kind of excite me personally. So I'm not typically the techno person, but I do like these complex rhythms. So any thoughts about this before we kind of look at the next step?
Well, yeah, Omri had a question.
Right. Yeah. The answer to that is that this drum module does respond to pressure sensitive gates, the gates that have multiple variations. So like on my, if you know the no control, this output, depending on how high your gate is, will trigger different volumes. This drum module just happens to respond to those values. And so I think what we're seeing is when 2 voltages are going into the OR at the same time, you may get a level increase on the voltage. So
it's a bad Boolean OR though.
Possibly.
That's not nice.
Well, yeah, is that what's happening? It could be that. It's hard to know.
Maybe it's the gate length or something like this.
It could be
maybe
the gate
when there are
length.
quicker gates, they are like shorter. So because it sounds really musical. It's like it sounds like a drummer playing with a hi-hat a bit. Sometimes the notes are shorter, and like the levels are a bit lower. It's really nice. Huh?
Yeah, you could run it through. Run it through the data.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
You want to? Yeah, let's run it through the data. Let's see what it's doing. It looks to me like it's just you can see we get these pulses that are close to each other. I am doing like one multiplication right here on this one channel of the muck slicer. And so I think it's actually the ratchet is maybe just, maybe this is responding when it hasn't fallen all the way. So yeah, it may be the length, it may be the ratchet. I don't have a great answer. I was wondering the same thing as we were listening. So,
could be the envelope on the drum machine is an analog envelope, and so it's re-triggering.
Yeah, that's
right. It's not re-triggering from start; it's re-triggering from wherever it was on the cycle.
Exactly. And again, because this module does respond to that velocity, it may be that there's like some like memory level that's kind of keeping it up a little higher. It's a very useful. I don't know. I'm still learning this module, so I'm sorry if I don't know more. But it definitely has to do with this Tubutech and Leipzig West collaboration. So yeah, if you guys like 606s, this is a pretty versatile, module. The other thing I like about it, not to go off too much, is that this sequencer connects behind. You can run this through MIDI, and then this actually connects. So everything is normaled on this sequencer into here. So I don't actually have to do a lot of patching. You don't have to have like a row of cables to get that going. Okay, I think this kind of covers everything I wanted to talk about in terms of like rhythmic programming. Obviously, there's a lot of places you can go. While I was prepping for this, I created some really complex drum lines that I kind of wish I had recorded, but I was just kind of like doing it, and then an hour would go by and I had to run off, and it could do a lot. So let's talk about some more. Let's talk about running these at audio rates. Not all logic sequencers or logic modules are created equal, and I wish I could tell you more than that. So I can't guarantee that every logic module you have will run at an audio rate, but most do. A lot do. So I'm just going to run a simple oscillator into our logic modules. So I'm just going to take the sine wave out. I just want you guys to listen to what it does to a sine wave. That doesn't sound like a sine wave, right? That sounds like a square wave. Just to be clear, this is a very pure sine. So that's what the sine wave normally would sound like. So the first thing you'll notice is that it sounds like a square wave, and obviously that's because we have our Boolean logic running, right? And so we're only getting an off or on. This is basically one way that you can get a square wave out of any other waveform. So wherever our, again, comparator is set in this logic module is going to shift how that sounds. If I run this into a comparator only, you see we get kind of the same result, and then you can kind of get some phase modulation depending on, or like a shifting, depending on your comparator. So the comparator does make a difference. This happens to be a window comparator as opposed to a simple single comparator. So I'm getting potentially twice as many outputs for a single, twice as many waveforms for a single output. If you guys want to see that on the scope, we can do that. You guys want to see that? Or yes? Okay.
Sure, yeah.
All right, so let's take here's our pure sine wave. I don't know what I did here. All right, and then we'll take that into one side, and then we'll come back, and that's too short. All right. And then we'll listen to that. So the blue trace is now our comparator. You can see it's all positive values. And as I shift, you can even hear it when it gets into that double frequency range. So if we take just the AND logic, you can see it's a pretty straight waveform. We're only getting it on the upper values, so nothing below 0. So you can also think of this as a half rectification, right? So it's the same, it's literally the same thing. The only difference is that we could then start merging that with, say, another audio signal. Let's take an audio rate waveform from so here we have like another waveform. When we take that in and we listen to it, we don't hear anything on AND. But, or, we should definitely hear more. Am I missing something? I'm not hearing this.
What's the other waveform?
The other waveform is just the sorry. It is this output from the quad function generator. I'm just running just a function generator in audio rate.
That should do.
Yeah.
It should do. Huh. Is that maybe a bad cable? Oh, you know what? Maybe my height isn't high enough on this output. Let's just let's try increasing it and see if that makes a difference. I don't know why the signal is not coming. Actually, there I'm seeing it.
Maybe skip the data, just to see if it's a problem of the through from the data.
That is odd. I see it's true. It's not going off. So maybe it was holding it too high. Maybe this output isn't a good choice. I don't... Let's try the maths version of the same thing. All right. Well, that one's working. So we'll use that one instead of the... instead of the 281. All right, back to where we were at. So we're saying and coming out into there, and let's turn the volume back up. There we go. That's what we were expecting to hear. So, yeah. The combination of those two is giving us now a very complex output. It sounds to me a lot like a ring modulator. But it's not a true ring modulator, which we may or may not get to today. Here's what the OR sounds like. I find this kind of logic to be very fun. Here's our X OR. So needless to say, there's a lot of sonic possibilities just with each of those different styles of logic combining two different audio rate waveforms. They're all kind of ring modulator-esque, but not quite. Yeah. Any other thoughts on this? I know I'm kind of moving quickly, and I think we're kind of... the one other thing I really wanted to talk about today before we move on is how to use logic in creating changes in music, in musical phrasing. So one thing that I really like to do is I like to use the AND output to combine two sequencers together. So let's let's take our, I'm going to go back to our, yeah, you will always end in the pulse waves. Okay, so we're going to use our foundation oscillator, and we're just going to make a simple sequence on our muck slicer. I'm going to take the output of our muck slicer, but I'm going to go into a precision adder just so we can add two values together. And then we'll take that into our oscillator. Okay, so we have a simple waveform, or I mean a simple sequence. We could put a gate and an envelope on there if we wanted to. Let's just do that real quick. I'll just take an output. We'll just use the. Okay, so here's our simple sequence. Now, one thing that we may want to do is we may want to transpose this sequence, right? So one way you can do that is, let's say I'm going to use the no control down below. I'm just going to go into the other side of our adder, and I can transpose. So I'm literally just transposing the volume or the pitch, right? But you may not want to do that in the middle of a sequence. You may not be able to, if I start clocking it, right, now we're getting two sequences, but this doesn't really give us any sort of predictability, right? So rather than clocking it from just the straight clock, I'm going to clock it from the and. We'll take our clock into one side, and then we're going to take our end of cycle into the other side. And now what happens is that every time we reach the end of cycle on the muck slicer, it's advancing the no control one step. And so we get a basically something that transposes every 8 steps. And this is useful for creating a slightly more, a longer phrase, but still is kind of unpredictable. Another way we might think about doing this, though, is like, what if we want to do this like in a musical phrase? Let's say we want to vamp on something for a certain amount of time. Like, we want to keep this one cycle going long enough where we kind of get used to what that phrase sounds like. So I like to use a switch for this. I'll still take the end of cycle into one side, and then I'm going to take a switch into the other side, and then I'm clocking the no control. And so what will happen now is that unless I've turned this on, we're going to stay here vamping and looping. And once I took out our adder. So with it off, we're now stopped on just one note, and when I'm ready to move on, I can turn on that latch, and now I've moved forward. Now I'm moving every 8 steps until I turn it off again. Does this make sense to everybody so far? Okay, so let's say, when you're using a sequencer, you can have that sequencer, you can sort of like hit a button, and then at the end of the next phrase, it will move on to the next section. right? You can actually build that here as well using exactly what we just did. The only thing I'm going to do different is that I'm going to mult my and out into my, mult first, and then I'm going to take that into that switch, and then into the mult. So now what happens, if we're listening, and I get to a phrase and I'm like, I want this to move on, I can hit my latch, it goes on, and then once it cycled, it turned off the switch for me. So I essentially just made, if I was using a longer phrase, like if I was using a 16-step sequencer or something that was more than 8, I could set this to latch. As soon as I'm ready, there I go, and hits, and now it moves on, and it moves on to the next step. But it doesn't keep going on because the and logic also turned off my step. I find that to be a really useful way to sort of like, then you have that phrase that you want to move on with, and the logic helps you keep it in time. It's synchronized. We're using the cycle properly, and the shift is always happening at a musical moment, but only when we're ready, and then it doesn't keep going on from there. So this was one of my favorite ideas that came into my head while I was working on this. I had used a similar idea before, where the other side of this and logic, rather than being a switch, is I would actually use like the touch plate on my no control. So basically, if I'm holding down a button, this is my and switch, the other side of my and switch. I get to the end of the phrase. As long as I'm holding it down, I move on. If I'm not holding it down, I sit there and I vamp until I'm ready to move on. One is just like a manual trigger. This one is a latching trigger, right, basically. And yeah. So I find that to be like a really musical way to utilize logic for phrases over time. And again, you could start combining them with the ORs and the XORs and things like that. So I don't know, Trovarsi, do you want me to keep going? Like, are you guys all having fun? Is this is this interesting to you?
Yeah.
All right.
We want to pause for a moment. Does anybody have any questions or comments or anything before we move on or continue on? Or I think everyone's just into it.
Everyone's just into it. The next part of the Boolean logic that I have in my notes, I'm not super strong with, but I find to be intriguing, is a phase-locked loop. Do you guys want to look at a phase-locked loop?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. All right.
Bring it on.
So I apologize if I'm not the most technical on this. I have only really happily patched a phase-locked loop 1 or 2 times while preparing for this. So hopefully we can get it going. For those of you who don't know what a phase-locked loop is, what we're essentially doing is we're taking two oscillators and we're going to synchronize them by using the XOR comparator. And what happens is sort of like hard sync, the XOR starts to feed the input of your second oscillator, and it will basically track the pitch of the first oscillator. And there's a lot of functionality for that that is not my forte. So I apologize if it comes out a little bit weird. The way I did this while prepping for this is I was using my 281 in audio rate, And we definitely want a comparator off of this. So the 281 does have a pulse end of cycle output. It is a little short for me for this example, so I prefer to use our actual comparator. I'm going to just mult it mostly so we can hear it at some point, what pitch we're creating. So this is where we're at with the pitch. And if we need to come back to it, we have it available to us. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take that mult into our comparator. And I found this to be a really fascinating way to use this. Actually, I'll mult it again. Sorry, I'm changing my mind on this as I go. One of the things that was interesting when I was researching this a little bit is that the person I saw doing it was using a clock divider to not just match the pitch, but also give you lower octaves based off of that pitch. We'll not go with that for now. Okay, so I'll take the output of our comparator into one side of our XOR. I'm going to then take the square output of my instro module, foundation module, into the other side of the XOR. We're going to take the XOR out, and we're going to come back into the volt per octave. And we'll just come out of the sine wave for now and listen to the sine wave. So again, we don't have a true sine wave. And as we adjust the pitch of this oscillator, sorry, I saw some waving. Did someone need something?
Sorry, there was a farewell.
Yes, he can to bounce.
Oh, okay, got it. So so if we listen to our original pitch, here's our original pitch, here's our phase locked loop. And you can hear that they interfere with each other a little bit. And we can get some pretty interesting noises out of that. Also, my comparator is going to give us a lot of filtering. Because we're essentially doubling the value of this at times, like we saw earlier. So because this is a window comparator as opposed to just a true full comparator, a single comparator. And of course, if we start taking other outputs, our triangle output has a different sound. The frequency of this oscillator sometimes makes the difference. It starts to sound like a wave folder a little bit. We can take the wavefold out. And there's a lot of interesting timbres just by using the oscillator. Now, other uses of phase locked loops would throw a filter in here, just so you guys can see what we're looking at. Actually, I didn't do this totally right, now that I think about it, because our frequency range is all positive, and for a phase locked loop to work correctly, we actually would want to center this. So I'm going to use our A times B plus C to shift this. Normally what you would want is, there's our centered frequency. We actually double it so that we're going from a full true 10 volt peak to peak range, and you'll hear this sounds different. Let's go back to the sine wave. There's some neat overtones by is to me one of the most complicated uses of the Boolean logic. I think it sounds amazing. I haven't found like the best place to use it, but
Yeah, no, it sounds cool. The timbre. Yeah.
yeah. I think, I mean, if if we want to get into analog logic, we could go that route. This was kind of everything I had notated for Boolean logic. Is there something that I missed? Anything else you guys want to cover? Yes.
I wonder if you have suggestions about, maybe it occurs to me you could use switches to denote sections for the rhythmic use of logic, so doing it at CV rates rather than audio rates. Have you played around with that much, and do you have any advice?
You mean in terms of like how I was talking about using the AND logic to sort of move through stages, or?
Yeah, I was even thinking simpler than that. When you were just purely running rhythms through it, you could put switches in front of it to introduce some variation there. If one of you played with that.
Yeah, I guess. I guess it depends on what you're feeding it. Essentially, a switch, in and of itself, depending if it's latching or not latching, is essentially like a divide by two, right? And so, in that sense, you could definitely build it that way if you want sort of like an alternating pattern going back and forth. I think that it definitely takes you down that route of making this complicated shape and then expanding it over time. I haven't done it very much myself. So again, like my preference would be more in I would use an AND logic to maybe switch between two different phrases, where I can sort of control things on that switch, if that makes sense. So like maybe I would have two different rhythms. Like let's say I took, okay, here's a for me an example I would use if I'm running. I like this idea of the OR and XOR, right? Maybe I would take the OR into one side of the switch, the XOR into the other side of the switch, and then I would use AND logic to choose which side it's running between, because those two logic outputs are going to give you different rhythmic variety. That might give you a complicated pattern that sort of switches back and forth on musical regularity. I think that would be sort of the way I would use it, if that makes sense. But otherwise, for me, I've always used the dividers as more of a driving the logic as opposed to alternating between different logic aspects. But certainly you could, this is a very flexible system, so anything you decided to build, I'm sure would work. Yeah, someone's mentioning that Pam's new workout is a great tool. I think Pam's is great because it has all of these functions, dividers, multipliers, all built in per section. When I was showing, if you guys know Stu J, I was showing him some stuff, and we were running Pam's much the same way into those logic gates. The nice thing about Pam's is you have a lot of flexibility. The downside is that you have to do a lot of menu diving to get to some of those. If you want to manipulate those in real time, Pam's is going to take you a little bit longer than maybe flipping a switch, right? But if you have your presets made, like if you're really like through composing something and you write a complicated part, Pam's is great. And you could definitely step through different outputs of Pam's using the switches and the logic also. So there's a lot of possibility for that. Yep. There's a lot of logic modules out there. Even I mean the comparator that I'm using, I tried to not talk about it too much, but it has all this Boolean logic built in down below as well. The main reason I wasn't using this is because I really like the interplay between the and NAND, or an XOR, and or and NOR, and XOR and XNOR. We could have gotten a lot of those same rhythms out of the comparator through the not, just multed it, and we could have had the same result. Another thing that's sort of interesting that I maybe didn't talk about is, if we're using an LFO to drive our logic modules, that's going to give you a different type of rhythmic output. So if you can see I did have it in mind at one point, because I have some LFOs here, and just running an LFO, we can start to see that we get lots of rhythmic ideas based off of that, and then using the comparator you can get different sizes, and you're going to get a different result if you have control over your comparator than if you use just the built-in one. Here we're getting just back and forth. If we started to use two at once, and we could sort of listen to what that is giving us. So because these LFOs aren't in sync with each other, we're getting one kind of OR output. If I run that into, let's say, this comparator instead, and I take the OR output, anytime that they're both active, it's going to hold it high, and so you can get into the weeds a little bit with that. Our OR is staying high because basically I set it up so that something is always up. So yep. This one also has a flip-flop, which is another type of Boolean logic that is essentially like a counter. You could think of it as a divide by two as well. So yeah. Oh, I see. One of my cables came out. So again, you can get, this is less structurally rhythmic, but you do start getting rhythmic examples by using the LFO through the comparator. So, have I experimented with VCAs as and? Obviously, it won't work for analog signals, but should work for fine. I haven't. I'm sorry. I'm still new at this. I'm sorry. It's not a place that I've used the VCAs.
Yeah, how would that work? I was curious about that.
I mean, technically, you need both signals to be high to get something out of the VCA, right? So if you plug one to the in, one to the CV, if just the in is high, nothing comes through because the CV is low. If just the CV is high, nothing comes through because the in is low. But if both are high, you get the high output from the in. So that should work as an AND just fine.
Yep, it makes sense.
As said, with analog signals, it won't, because then you get the actual signal path of the analog signal. So it's then more like an analog whatever it is. I don't know. It's not an analog AND at that point. It's weird. But for digital signals, Boolean signals should do.
Right. So I'll just take the square outputs of my Batumi. We'll run one into the... so here's my offset. So here we're getting here's our rhythm from this square wave, right? And then basically what he's saying is if we take another square wave and we run that into the CV control, basically only when this LFO is hot does it allow this LFO to go through. And so there's our similar analog signal. I mean our Boolean and. It totally makes sense to me. So same thing. Yeah, you don't necessarily need dedicated modules to do this.
Yeah, also in a pinch, like if you need another and, you might have it right there.
Exactly. Does anyone have any questions about how we did that real fast? I'll try and, let's see. Yeah.
Ed had a comment. What module are you referring to, Ed?
That's the 4 HP Doppler. The 150 is a dual VCS switch. It's basically like a VCA with no attenuation.
Okay.
So it's very much what we were just talking about. But you can do and, or, and not, and probably other things if you concentrate. But the idea of doing logic with things that aren't branded a logic module is kind of core to stuff for me as well. This is a terrific talk, by the way. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ed.
And I try not to have any module at the center of all my patches, and I'm disappointed in myself because the compare to is there. It's great for me for voices coming and going.
It's a really fantastic, really fantastic module. On Ed's point, to get the NOR of anything, you could just run it through an attenuverter and just take just flip the polarity, and then you have your. As we were this was definitely on my mind for the analog logic, because you can use analog logic for all these Boolean operations, even if it's sort of not, like you said, it's not designed to be that, it's not specific to that, but it works great for that purpose. So
I mean, you could use any mixer as an OR if you know that the output is somewhat limited. Like obviously, if it's not, then you will break the input you're going to. But like if you know it does a max of 10 volts output or whatever,
right,
just use it as a multi-input OR if you want to.
Right. Well, and for those of us that play with the in the 4U format banana cables, if you take two gates and you put them into each other, if these were coming from two different gate rhythms into one input, that's that's an OR right there also. So it's one of the quote unquote advantages. I guess you could do it with a stackable as well, in theory, although I think there's some reasons with the grounding that it's better on banana than on 3.5 millimeter, but I don't know. I'm not an electrical engineer. Sorry.
Awesome. This has been great, Anton. I really appreciate you coming on and walking us through and taking us through all this. I learned a lot.
Cool. My pleasure.
Yeah.
And one thing I'm thinking about right now that we didn't get to is sort of the probability on some of these gates, and how you can use probability into the logic or out of your logic into a probability module. Really gives you a lot of possibilities as well. So, I'm sorry that we didn't go down that route, because that's a fun, especially when you start combining sort of the to me, like taking those rotating and sequence, like the rotating hi-hat idea, and then you run probability on that in addition to it, it really starts giving you this sort of endless rhythmic concept that always works, but you get away from straight eighth note or straight 16th note hi-hats. The OR XOR, or NOR kind of thing. You take one into the open hi-hat and the other into the closed hi-hat, as opposed to, I was using tom and snare in today, but open hi-hat versus closed hi-hat, using all of these logic options really produces complex hi-hat patterns if drums are your thing. So
And I
Yeah.
forgot, what's the name of the module? You're talking about the probability module that's next to your clock.
this probability
that one.
module, this one's called the missed opportunities.
Yeah.
It's the Qt Lab out of New York. It's a really cheap, not really cheap. It's an affordable probability module. The only thing that I quote unquote don't like about it is that without CV control over the density, which is basically your probability rate, it's always at 50%. So I pretty much always have some fader, with a DC offset feeding into it. Of course, you could also use an LFO or whatever to modulate the probability values, and it's for gates. I can't think of the term. No. There's a term for these types of gates, but I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. I apologize. But
Bernoulli gate?
What's that? Yes,
Bernoulli gate?
for Bernoulli gates. And this particular module, what happens is that, again, it's cascading. So the outputs are of each of the 4 gates are normal to the inputs of the next 4 gates, and you can choose between a miss or a match being what feeds into the cascading logic. So if I use the miss, I like to use miss a lot to drive 2 different sequencers. So if those 2 sequencers are tuned, in the same relative key, and then I send this as the clock to step forward those sequencers, if one triggers, then the first sequencer triggers. But if it doesn't, then I have the next sequencer has the opportunity to move, and then the next sequencer has the opportunity to move, and so on. So you get this. It's almost contrapuntal in that it sort of something always has the chance of playing. It will always be musical, but it's just one phrase. On the match side, it's the same concept, but instead of a miss, it's when it triggers, it goes out and hits the next one. And this is really great if you're using probability for, I can think of it like accents. So like if I have one note, triggering, as it cascades down, I could have more and more things playing together. And so you can get sort of a probabilistic accents. And this particular one has a reset because it is a digital random. It has a new seed every time that it starts up. So if you use the reset, you can sort of always be using the same chunk of the seed at the beginning. And so you can get repeatable phrases from that seed from when it was turned on, as opposed to just allowing it to. And if you guys want to go down that rabbit hole sometime, that's a whole other side of things. So
I think we should. I mean, not in this moment, perhaps, but I think we should do it.
yeah,
I'm pretty sure everyone here would be game.
the shift register realm for that, for sure. And the difference between digital and analog random. So was there anything else you guys want to go through?
This has been great. Does anybody have any questions or anything? Before we...
No, I just had a comment. Thanks, Anton, for this, and I look forward to playing with 2 Logic mods.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I hope it was useful somehow,
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. And the someone suggested a sample and hold with a comparator should make for an expensive but veritable Bernoulli gate. I would say the answer is yes. I mean, we could do it if you guys want to see it real quick.
Yeah, sure. If you have before we wrap it up, we could end it with that.
Yeah, I mean.
All right,
so,
cool.
Basically we have our just a trigger. So here we're triggering our random, and then we take the output of our sample and hold into our, and there you go. And I guess if we wanted to do it like truly like rhythmically, we could take another rhythm, and as long as we're, so here you can see we're just alternating between high and low, and so there's our random probability based off of the speed of this LFO is triggering when this may or may not pass, and this one is triggering whether or not it is true or not.
Then I think you don't even need a comparator. I thought the comparator as a way to set the probability, because with the white noise random distribution, the window size should define how much throughput you have, basically.
I think it does. Yes. So, I think you could go either way.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're correct. I was over.
No,
I
I mean your way is
explicit.
the other option. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's true. Yeah. I just thought it's a nice idea for anyone not having a missed opportunity or any other Bernoulli gate.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So, I don't have anything else to say on that. You are correct, sir.
Okay, on that note, I'm gonna say thank you, and wait, before everyone takes off, I'm just gonna stop the recording.